Welcome to Secret Squared. I'm Cassie Secret, I'm Megan Secret, and today we're going to continue our series on factoring, and we're going to look at factor by grouping. So let's dive in. So for factor by grouping, just like for factoring trinomials, we needed a few certain things to happen. Same thing for this. One thing that we need to happen is, unlike trinomials that have 3 terms, for this one, we are going to need there to be 4 terms. And not only do there need to be 4 terms, the 4 terms, for us to use them, have to be written in standard form. And just a reminder, standard form is when we have the highest powered exponent written first, and then the next exponent, and then we just keep descending. That order is going to be super, super important. Now, an example of what that could look like could be something like x to the power of 3 minus 2x squared plus 3x minus 6. This has 4 terms. Again, terms are separated by pluses and minuses. And this is in standard form because the biggest exponent, 3, goes first, then the exponent of 2, then the invisible exponent of 1, and then the constant or the number that does not have an exponent or does not have a variable goes on the end. So for us to factor by grouping, we are going to do an example as we go through all the steps. So for our very first step, we are going to make sure we put it in standard form. And again, standard form have that biggest exponent first and then descending exponents. In this case, we actually lucked out and our example is already written that way, so we don't have to rewrite it. So that's good. And even if you have to do that, normally it's just a little bit of rearranging. Good for that. Next thing we're going to do is we are going to look for GCF. Every single time you factor, no matter what, you always want to look and see if there's a GCF that you can take out. In this case, all of the coefficients that we have and the number on the end is a 1. So all of those, what they have in common is 1. And there is no x in our GCF because there's not an x in the very last term. So our GCF is just 1, which means you actually don't have to do anything with it because dividing out that GCF of 1 is not going to change your problem. But sometimes you might have a problem where you need to do that. So now that we put it's in standard form, we've checked for the GCF, we are now going to actually do the grouping in factor by grouping. So we're going to group the first 2 terms together and last 2 terms together. Now, that's why it's called grouping. Really what we're doing is we are going to be making little groups or little pairs. The first 2 terms are going to go together, and so are the last 2 terms. So what you can do is just draw a little line just to make it clear. Here's one group, here's the other group. Exactly. And that's also why it's important you write it in standard form. That way you get the right terms being paired together. Now from there, our very next step is you want to find the GCF of each of our group. So even more GCF, so we're going to look at the left side of the blue line and the right side of the blue line. Now, important note, I know we talked about a GCF at the beginning. That was the GCF for all 4 terms. Now that we're just considering 2 terms on its own and another 2 terms on its own, you actually might now have a GCF that shows up. So looking at this, the coefficients are both 1, so there's no number in common, but they both do have a variable. And when they both have a variable in common, we're going to take the lowest number of them. So in this case, we have the x cubed and the x squared. So we're going to take an x squared, or we are going to divide that out. Yep. So we're taking that lowest exponent. So let me just make a little note on the side. Our GCF for that is going to be x squared. So we are going to have to divide that out in a second, but we're just going to look at the right side. We have an x minus 1. First of all, they do not both have a variable, so we can't have a variable in the GCF. This is really a 1x. Both of them have a 1, so that GCF is really just like it was for the full thing. The GCF for this side is still going to be a 1, which does happen sometimes. That does not mean you're wrong. So once you have those GCFs, now we're going to go ahead and divide them. So for the very first 2 terms, divide by the x squared. So you're going to end up getting, so now we end up with x cubed divided by x squared. That gives us just 1x. Right here, x squared divided by x squared gives itself is just a 1, but we have a negative, still have that negative, so we need to have a minus 1. And we need to keep that GCF in the very front. Yep, and let me just make sure I add my little arrow there. And then do the exact same thing for the next set. So for the second 2 terms, the GCF was 1, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to divide them by 1. In this case, I'm just going to do it, that way it helps us see our steps. We are going to have, you divide by 1, doesn't change, that x is still an x, that negative 1 is still minus 1. put parentheses, and your GCF in this case was a 1, so we're going to put that in front. And to be clear, that 1 that we divided out was positive, so I'm going to put plus 1. So I want you to think that plus 1, it's almost like bridging the gap between these two chunks, so that plus 1 connects it all. Once you've gotten to here, you are almost done. Now, one thing that you should start to notice as you do grouping problems is we have x minus 1s, so we have a term in the front and term at the end. Those should have x minus 1s in the parentheses. They need to be matching, they need to be identical. That has to happen, otherwise that means something is wrong. Doesn't really matter what is inside the parentheses, just that they are both the same thing. They both could be x plus 1, x minus 10, as long as they match. They could both be 2x plus 3 on the inside, but they have to be the exact same thing. Now, for our very last step, we're going to factor out the common binomial. Yep, when we say in common, it is something that is in both of them, just like the x minus 1. And then binomial, that means something that's two terms. This is two terms, that is two terms. Because we have the x and we have that one. So in this case, that common binomial is actually that x minus 1. So when we're saying that we're factoring out, what that really means is the x minus 1, we are taking it and we are grabbing it out of both of the terms. We are factoring it out. It is the GCF of this point. Now, once you factor out or take it away from here, these are now going to be gone or go away. And everything that's left, that x squared and that positive 1, those are now going to end up together in a set of parentheses. So let me go ahead and highlight those. So your x squared and that plus 1, they're going to end up being together. So the reason this is happening is if you look at this very final answer, if you were to multiply it out, you multiply x minus 1 to the x squared. Right here, there's our x minus 1 times x squared. If you were to multiply x minus 1 to the 1, here's our x minus 1 times the 1. So it just looks a little bit different, but we multiply that out, that gives us exactly what we had right here. So right now we're just finding the simplest way of writing it. And as a reminder, you could take those set of parentheses and swap them. It does not matter which one is written first, as long as that is what you have inside of both of your parentheses. And that is going to be your answer. So for our next example, we are going to start with negative 5x plus x squared plus x cubed minus 5. We are going to have to factor it. First things first, we're going to have to put it into standard form because this is not in standard form because it is not the highest exponent to the lowest exponent. So we're going to start with that x cubed is the highest exponent. That goes first. Then we're going to want the x squared. Then we're going to want the minus 5x and the minus 5. So putting it in standard form is normally just rearranging, so it's not very difficult. Then the next one, you want to look for GCF. In this case, we have coefficients of 1 in the front, two terms, and then negative 5, negative 5. The only thing that all of those have in common is 1, and there's not a variable in all four of the terms, so there is no number in your GCF. So in this case, there is not a GCF for all four terms, so we don't have to worry about it. So next thing, we are now going to do the actual grouping and factor by grouping. So we're going to group the first two terms together and the last two terms together. So we kind of just split it up. Now, it really does matter when you split it up, that negative has to stay with the 5. Don't split it up here. You have to make sure whatever sign is in front of that number stays with the number. So now we're going to look at each of the chunks and we're going to see what the GCF is. So right here we have an x cubed and an x squared. Both of them have a coefficient of 1, so their number in the GCF is just 1. They both do have variables though, so we're going to take the lowest number of those variables, in this case that x squared. So make little notes that the GCF is going to be an x squared. And then for the very next one, let me go ahead and move that out of the way. For the next one, when we have our negative 5x minus 5, both of those 5s, we can go ahead and divide it by 5. But there's no x in the GCF because there's no x in that very last term. So now we're going to divide those out. So on the right side, we are going to divide away our GCF, the x squared from both terms, and we'll end up with x cubed divided by x squared. Again, the quotient rule tells us to subtract the exponents. 3 minus 2 gives us a 1. So we end up with just an x, or you can write x the first, same thing. And then right here, x squared divided by itself is going to give you a positive 1. And because we had a GCF, we need to write that x squared in the very front. Now, doing the exact same thing on the next side, our GCF was that 5, so I'm going to divide it away. when you do that, in this case, negative 5x divided by 5 is going to be negative x. And then negative 5 divided by 5 is negative 1. And you want to put your parentheses, and your GCF in this case was a positive 5. And this is where we look at it, and like the last one, the things in parentheses, they should match because they're going to be our common binomial. The problem is these do not match. So what happens is when we're looking at this chunk of terms right here, and we have that the 5 doesn't work, that means we need to use a negative 5. And a trick that can be very helpful, if you're looking at these and comparing them, they almost look like they're the exact same. They're just off by a sign, or they're off by a negative. So the fix that we're going to do for this is our GCF, we're going to go back and make it a negative 5. Once you do that, then all of a sudden, all of your signs are going to switch. So inside the parentheses, they're going to become positives. But make sure you change that your GCF was actually a negative 5. A good rule of thumb is typically if that very first term or that leading coefficient is negative, that's probably a hint your GCF is also going to be negative. If you're not comfortable, try the positive 5, and then if they don't match, maybe you switch it to the different sign later on. Exactly. So when in doubt, try one. If it doesn't work, then you can try the other. And then for the last step, we actually have our common binomial. We have the x plus 1. We are going to factor that out. So we are going to end up with that x plus 1 times something, and that something is going to be everything that is left over that was not in the common binomial, in this case, that x squared minus the 5. And then just another reminder, you could have the order of these swapped, but it doesn't change your answer. So here is our answer. So for our next example, we're going to have to factor 2x cubed minus 6x squared plus 8x minus 24. First thing is still to put it in standard form. Thankfully, it's already in standard form, so we can skip that step. Now we're going to look for GCF if there's something in common between all those terms. Because all of them do not have variables, there's not a variable in the GCF, but we have a 2, a 6, an 8, and a 24. Because they are all even, a 2 goes into all of those numbers. So our GCF is actually going to be 2. And in this case, since our GCF is something that's not 1, we actually do have to take the next step of dividing it all out. So we're going to divide each of the terms by 2. So we're going to have 2 divided by 2 just gives us 1. So we'll have 1x cubed, or you could just write x cubed. None of those variables or the exponents are going to change because there was no variable in our GCF. Then we have a negative 6 divided by 2 gives us a negative 3. And then we're going to keep the x squared. 8 divided by 2 gives us a 4. We're going to keep the x. And negative 24 divided by 2 will give us a negative 12. And we're going to keep that GCF right in the front. Now, a benefit of having that GCF is now all of the numbers that we're working with are smaller than what we started with, which is always helpful. So then from here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to be grouping. So of these 4 terms, you're pretty much going to be ignoring the GCF. We're just going to make sure to keep including it because it has to be part of our answer. But as we're grouping, we're only working with what's in the parentheses. We split it up, so the first 2 terms are going to be together, and the second 2 terms are going to be together. And now we're going to find the GCF of these 2 terms, and then the GCF of the right 2 terms. For the left, and you might notice that we tend to kind of follow a pattern, both of these 2 terms, like in the last problem, have a variable. So we're going to divide out a variable, in this case, the lower of those 2, so we have an x squared. So we're going to divide out an x squared, and that is going to be our GCF. Doesn't have any number besides the x squared because they both have a coefficient of just 1. Yep. Sorry, one's a 1 and one's a negative 3. And then remember, we're, like Megan said, we're taking the lower powered exponent. And then on the right side, when we're looking at the 4x minus 12, that GCF, there's no variable in it because there's not a variable with the 12. But 4 and 12 can both be divided by 4, so that's going to be our GCF. Now I'll actually divide those GCFs away. So we'll divide an x squared, divide an x squared. So we have, by the quotient rule, we're going to subtract the exponents. 3 minus 2 gives us a 1. So we have an x, or an x to the first. Right here, those x squareds will cancel out, and we have just the negative 3. And we do have to keep that x squared in the front. And this is where it can look a little bit messy. I'm going to put a big set of parentheses, and that 2 is going to stay on the outside of everything. We're just making sure to tag it along. Most people will, if they don't keep writing it, they tend to forget it. So just make sure it's there for yourself. Then for the right side, divide by our GCF of 4. So divide by 4. That's going to get us divide just those front numbers. 4 divided by 4 is 1, keep the x. And then negative 12 divided by 4 is negative 3. Put your parentheses, and whatever your GCF was needs to go in the front of your parentheses. And it is a positive 4, so we're going to put a plus. And then right here, we can double check that we do have that common binomial. Those things inside the parentheses, they match. And if they don't match, that just means probably something happened with your GCF. And now we're going to have to factor out that x minus 3. So taking out that x minus 3, because that's what is in common, we can factor it out. We take out the x minus 3 from both terms. And once you take out the x minus 3 from both terms, the only thing that's going to be left is that x squared plus 4. I'm just going to make that super clear that's coming
thank you.
right there. And then we still have that 2 as that very first GCF tagged out on the outside. So I'm going to put a 2 right in the very front. And just a reminder that this x squared plus 4 came from these terms, and this was really our common binomial. So this is going to be our final answer. So there we go. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other topics you want us to cover in later videos, leave us a comment below. We'll see you next time.